Welcome back, everyone. We're going to kind of continue with the theme that we ended on with Assistant Administrator Schiffer and talk about, on this panel, kind of forging a more effective U.S. approach in the Global South, which of course allows for more potential competition with China as it focuses more strategically on the developing world. And we have a really fantastic panel of experts here from the U.S. government and from the private sector to discuss these issues. So I will briefly introduce them now. To my far left, we have Simon Littlewood, who's the CEO of SDG Global Group. Simon has over 3 decades experience founding, investing in, raising, and structuring capital for and advising businesses across a wide range of industry sectors and geographies. He's known for his approach and innovative design of deals, financial products, and structures. He's worked in both developed and emerging markets, starting in Africa and Southeast Asia in the 1980s, and then subsequently spending over 2 decades investing, working, and living in China. Simon, glad to have you here. To my right, we have Daphne McCurdy. Daphne is a senior advisor in the Office of China Coordination in the U.S. Department of State. Prior to State Department, Daphne served as foreign policy advisor to U.S. Senator Jeff Merkley, where she oversaw the senator's work on the Foreign Relations Committee and the Appropriations, State, and Foreign Operations Subcommittee. Previously, Daphne served as USAID OTI Syria Deputy Country Representative based at the U.S. Consulate in Istanbul, and as a countering violent extremism specialist in State's Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. Daphne, thank you for being with us. And Naz El-Khatib is Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy in the U.S. Development Finance Corporation. Naz leads DFC's foreign policy team there. And before joining DFC, he served at the State Department, where he primarily covered Indo-Pacific affairs, among a range of other policy areas, as a member of the counselor's staff, and separately advised the Chief of Staff to the Secretary on internal initiatives. And he previously served as an Associate Director of Policy at National Security Action, which is a nonprofit organization, and as Deputy Chief of Staff to the Global Managing Partner of McKinsey, among many other roles. So truly a great kind of cross-section of folks looking at these issues from U.S. government and the private sector perspective. I want to kick things off by asking a question that kind of gets at the heart of where I think we are in our politics right now. I mean, we brought this group together, of course, primarily to talk about the U.S. government and policy role in the Global South and our ability to compete. But, and we've talked about that for much of the last 2 days at this conference, but we are at this moment in the United States where a lot of Americans are unconvinced of the need for U.S. global leadership and the importance of foreign aid and diplomacy. So I guess the question to kind of kick things off, or rather, maybe not an easy question, is why should the U.S. government or the U.S. people care about the developing world when we have so many other challenges going on at this moment? So I'll open that up. I don't know, Daphne, if you want to kick things off, I'll turn to you.
Sure,
and we'll go around.
Well, first of all, thanks, Dave, for convening this really great panel, and to the Atlantic Council on Notre Dame for having this excellent conference. On your question, I think it's a really important one, and one, frankly, that the Biden administration has really put a premium on, really trying to break down the silos between what is our domestic policy and what is our foreign policy. And I think that's reflective in the fact that Secretary Blinken, the first speech that he gave in the role was a foreign policy for the American people. And the premise there is really that the challenges that we're dealing with globally, or I'm sorry, are dealing with domestically are actually global transnational challenges, ones that we can't do alone, confront alone. So obviously the most salient is the COVID-19 pandemic, where we saw that vulnerable health systems in one part of the world impacted the health of everyday Americans. We've seen it with the horrific war in Ukraine that has led to rising oil prices and gas prices here. And then I think the biggest challenge is climate change, and one that I know we're all working on daily. And you know, the U.S. might be a large contributor of carbon emissions at 15%, but the rest of the world is contributing the remaining 85%. And so we really can't tackle that challenge without all working together. I'd also just note, and the second part of the issue set is, I think, one more abstract, but just as pressing and maybe gets at the nexus with strategic competition, is that right now we're also at this inflection point where we're seeing authoritarian revisionist powers really try to challenge the global order in a way that actually has direct impacts on Americans, and trying to rewrite the rules of the road, the way that we share data, the way that we protect privacy, the way that we engage in free debate. And so while it may feel abstract, that sort of challenge to the global order is actually one that could really impact the day-to-day freedoms that we as Americans, I think, cherish.
Those are some really, really important points. Thank you. And really linking those domestic interests of regular Americans on the street and what's happening in ways that people wouldn't necessarily think of globally. So thank you. Naz, any other thoughts on this?
Well, I'm happy to briefly comment on this. Thank you again, Dave, for hosting us and for the work that the Atlantic Council and Notre Dame are doing to put on this conference. I mean, I completely agree with what Daphne put forward. At the end of the day, the American foreign policy approach has to be oriented in delivering for the American people. That's why the core pillars of the administration strategy actually focus first and foremost on investing at home directly, investments in our industrial base, investments in our energy base, and our ability to combat some of the challenges that Daphne pointed out. But central to that idea, because of the nature of the shared challenges that we've discussed already, is the idea that American foreign policy also has to deliver for people around the world. That's good for them, that's good for the United States, and it's part of the sort of core premise of our approach to development policy as well. It's the idea that animates why we want to invest in, for example, a solar manufacturing facility in India that is with a US company but employs Indian workers, that sources supply chain materials from countries other than China, so we can avoid some of the human rights issues that sort of speak to the authoritarian revisionism that Daphne was mentioning. It's why we want to invest in vaccine manufacturing around the world to help prevent disease incidents in other countries before those diseases hit American shores. It's why we want to invest in the engine of most economies around the world, small businesses, so that people in those countries are successful, that their innovation can benefit Americans, but also that in certain parts of the world, including in our own hemisphere, people have the tools, the opportunities, the resources they need to stay in their own communities where, of course, in many cases, they'd prefer to. All of those help the American people. They also help people around the world, and I think that's a central aspect of what we're collectively trying to do as part of this administration.
Great, thank you. Simon, any additional thoughts on this?
Yeah. I took the metro here, so my sort of short half-hour journey involved walking a 5-minute walk to the metro. There were 2 beggars on the street, and then on the metro itself, there were 3 beggars. And I flew into the airports here, and the airports are run down, the bridges are broken, the roads are broken. So if I were an American citizen and taxpayer, I would be saying, hey, why are we shifting all this cash overseas when we have many, many issues at home? So I think in answer to your question, yeah, I can see why a lot of American people are sitting there going, why are we doing sort of 50 billion here, 50 billion there? Because we have our own problems and we should be fixing those. So to now counter my own argument, I think there is a huge role for the private sector in the US to get involved worldwide. Now, that's generating wealth for the US economy, generating jobs. It means that the investments that US companies are making in their technology can find a market. Now, by not engaging in the rest of the world, the US risks losing those markets, which ultimately hits US companies, which then hits the US people. So if you look at it from an economic perspective, it is a very good long-term investment for the US to be investing in other markets. But I would say that it should be more of an investment. So I think this idea of donating money and aid, there is obviously a role for that where there's a crisis. But I think the role of the US government is to support US people and US businesses, and that should be much more focused on how do you support the private sector to get into these markets, rather than let's donate money.
Yeah.
But just to pick up on one of your points as well, which I think is essential, and this is one of the, I'm from the UK originally, and this is a big issue in Europe, is how do you stop the immigrants coming in? Because if people are losing their livelihoods in these countries from climate change or war or whatever, they're going to get on boats, or in this case, come across the border in the US. Now, the big issue in the UK right now is how do you stop that? And the answer is that you stop the reason why they're fleeing in the first place. And that's about investing in those countries and creating jobs, which is the point you made, that the only way to solve the immigration problem globally is to start investing. And that's the great strength that the US has. It has the biggest investment and finance industry in the world. It still has the best base of technology. It should be going out into these countries, creating the jobs, which solves the problem.
Yeah, so I want to pick up on that and ask especially the two of you, and we'll come to more questions for you in a sec, Daphne. But the role of the private sector, right? I think everyone agrees that this is essential, but I want to draw out a little bit more from you, Simon, and you from Naz as well. What is the role of the private sector in bolstering these relationships between the U.S. and developing countries and offering these oft-mentioned alternatives to what China is offering in terms of financing and investment, particularly, I think, in the digital space? And then, you know, and this, I guess, mostly for you, Naz, kind of what can the U.S. government be doing to better partner with private industry, to spur investment, to mitigate risk, these sorts of things? So maybe we'll start with you.
Well, I'm happy to touch on this. I think, as Simon was mentioning, the private sector has an enormous role to play. The scope and scale of the challenges that Daphne was outlining earlier are so massive on such a global scale that the idea or notion that public capital alone can solve them is not realistic. And so that's the fundamental premise. The question then is how do you structure that? How do you make that effective? And you know, at the end of the day, it really does come down primarily to money. It's about devoting investment and resources to the solutions to some of these challenges. And from our experience in this job, I've been fortunate to travel to over 30 countries. What you hear time and time again, both from governments and from the private sector, is that there is an appetite to make these investments, but that there are barriers or challenges to entering different markets that private sector companies face. Sometimes that's on the regulatory side, which is an area where the US government and other governments can play a role. But sometimes it's just in a private company's ability to assess the risk in a particular market. That can be political risk. They're not sure how to deal with that sort of tail risk that most investment analysts aren't trained to manage. Sometimes it's about credit risk. You don't have as much experience in a market. It's hard to assess what pricing you should use or what sorts of rates you should charge. Those are all areas where the US government, other governments, and particularly the role of development finance institutions can play a big part. The Development Finance Corporation, for those who are less familiar with the agency, is one of the newest agencies in the US federal government. It was founded in 2018 by an act of Congress called the BUILD Act. And the whole mission or theory of the case behind it was to mobilize exactly this kind of activity. The US DFC has a range of financial products that it can offer directly to companies. It does not work in the vast majority of cases with governments. That money is going directly to the private sector. It's in the form of political risk insurance, which helps with political risk. We do lending and equity investments, which also help with some of the other situations that I discussed. And we can offer terms because we're a government institution that are attractive to the private sector in these markets. For example, much longer tenor rates on bonds because some of these investments take so long to mature, and the private capital market isn't willing to wait that long to generate a return. So that's one way that the government can help. It's also, I think, amplifies or sort of suggests why we as a government are so invested in this. It's the only way to solve the challenge. But I just want to end by saying it's also not just about money. I mean, money is a major part of it, but it's not the only element. And this is where standards come in. This is where having companies that have done this before at an exceedingly high level, best in class, internationally best in class level in other markets can bring an enormous amount of expertise to new settings. And I'll give you an example. Our CEO traveled to the country of Georgia in 2022 and visited a hospital that DFC had helped finance, the American Hospital in Tbilisi, which not only was a best in class healthcare facility in Georgia that attracted not only patients from that country, but from the whole region. The process of going through, the process to earn DFC financing set a new standard for that sector and really for that economy in terms of what a financial plan could look like, what a business plan could look like. We heard that repeatedly on the ground from not just members of the healthcare sector, but from other sectors as well. That's useful. It has a sustainability effect. It has a multiplier effect, and that, I think, is a role the private sector can play as well.
That's a really important point, and not one that I think people think of a lot when they think of DFC these days, but that standard setting aspect and the role there. Simon, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think you touched on the whole risk point. And I think that's actually key to one of the reasons why capital isn't flowing into some of the global south countries. So If you look at the ESG sector, for example, you're looking at $30+ trillion sitting in funds in the US and Europe. Now, why is it that Africa is only attracting less than $10 billion in private equity when you've got so much money available? So Africa needs power, it needs water, it needs food, it needs everything that ESG funds should be doing. But if you speak at ESG conferences like I do and say, right, now who wants to invest in Africa, everybody puts their heads down. I mean, the reality is they perceive these countries as being too risky. Now, they are risky. China was extremely risky when we started investing there in the 90s. People like us took the risk, and people in America and Europe will take the risk on Africa and Latin America and other developing markets. But I think here again, people like the DFC have a role to play in trying to de-risk that. And you do see it with some of the embassies that the US has worldwide. There are a couple of embassies in Africa that are extremely aggressive in terms of getting information out there, identifying the opportunities for the private sector. And where you have those ambassadors and their teams who are actually doing this work, you see a lot of US investment. Mm-hmm. And then you have other countries where the embassy is maybe not as supportive and you're just not seeing the investment because people are looking and going, well, you know, it's risky. We don't really know what's going on there. So I think people like the Atlantic Council, the DFC, USAID, a lot of the US institutions from the government and not-for-profit and media side need to be getting the messages out there that, yes, these are high-risk markets. It's not as risky as investing in Florida. But, you know, there are opportunities, and you price that in. The US has the biggest financial market in the world. The two largest stock exchanges are here in the US. They dwarf. The rest of the world put together is smaller than the US finance industry. So that money should be going in. That is one of the US's greatest assets, and it's not being deployed. I mean, how many global South companies do you see listing in New York? The US has shied away from the digital finance sector, which is the fastest growing sector and is where most of the global South will be financed. So if the US isn't adopting those tools, it's handing it to other countries.
And in some of these different sectors, right, the United States has to some degree, to zero in and prioritize where we're going to focus in terms of mitigating risk and supporting private sector investment, I would think. So Simon, I just want to follow up with you in terms of, you know, where do you see the greatest opportunities for U.S. investment in different developing regions? So, for example, Secretary Blinken recently in Africa was talking about enhancing food production, climate-smart technologies, agricultural services. Do these seem like the right priorities to you? Does it depend very much, obviously, country by country? And what would you maybe add to that list?
I mean, the Global South is massive in terms of difference. I mean, first of all, it's a lot of people, but you go from extremely wealthy small countries to very large poor countries. So there's no one size fits all. But what you can say as a general thing is these countries have a less developed financial system than they would in Europe or the US or Japan. They have energy issues because the world has energy issues. How do you bring the cost of energy down and try and get it cleaner? And how do you produce more food and get that done cheaply? Mm-hmm. Yes, Secretary Blinken was discussing food, and that is by far right now the biggest issue in many countries because of food inflation here and you know, even in the UK. But in Africa, doubly so, because they started off with not much money. So when you double the price of food, that means they just don't have money for food. Now, bizarrely, Africa has 2/3 of the world's remaining arable land. So here's a continent that's importing food with money that it has to borrow at high interest rates when it has the ability to feed the whole world itself. So in terms of what should the US be doing, well, the US is one of the largest agricultural producers in the world. Prices for every agricultural good is priced in US dollars. So the US controls the world's food industry. Why is it not taking those skills and those technologies into Africa? And how do these institutions actually support that? Because the US knows food. And food is not just about growing the grain, it's about the water, it's about the energy, it's about the logistics, the payment systems. Now, we've got projects for growing food in Africa, but the problem is there's no market. So if the farmer grows the food, he doesn't get paid, so why would he grow the food? There's no logistics to get it from his farm into a market. So he grows enough for himself and the village, which means the country ends up importing. If I go to them, and this is what we do, we go to them and say, I have a purchase contract. You grow the food and we will get it to the market, which means you get paid. Now, who's the biggest consumer on the planet of just about everything? It's the US. Now, if I go with a purchase order from the US, then they will invest. So it is in many ways very, very simple. It's about looking at markets. When I was based in China, we used to go with purchase orders from the Chinese buyers. And then the farmers all over the world would produce in Brazil or in Argentina or in South Africa. They would produce because they knew they were going to get paid, which is why China has such an attractive package. And the US needs to replicate some of that and look at market forces, which is kind of what the US is supposed to be about.
Well, we'll probably come back to that, but I want to shift gears a little bit and ask you, Daphne. So another one of the administration's priorities is diversifying supply chains with trusted allies and partners. Obviously, that means engagement with fellow developed democracies, but of course, it also means engagement with a lot of developing countries through which these supply chains would flow. So I'm curious, if anything to kind of shed light on how the U.S. engagement with the Global South, with the developing world, fits into that broader priority.
Well, thanks so much for the question. And I think it actually connects back to the first question about how does this impact the American people. And obviously, COVID brought into sharp relief the importance of having not only diversified supply chains, but resilient ones. And so we've been working, again, not just with our like-minded allies and partners, but throughout the world to really try to build resilient, transparent, diverse and secure supply chains. And just to give a couple examples of how we've been doing that. So in July 2022, Secretary Blinken co-hosted a supply chain ministerial with Commerce Secretary Raimondo, and it brought together 18 countries, and this included a diverse array. In addition to our European and Asian partners, included Brazil, included DRC, included Indonesia, who all signed up for a declaration for principles around supply chains, which again sort of reinforced what I just mentioned about transparency, security, openness, and diversification. We're also seeing this play out in all of our economic engagements with our partners. So there is a supply chain pillar in our Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is an engagement with 13 Southeast Asian countries. Also similarly with our American Partnership for Economic Prosperity, which is with 11 Latin American countries. So this is really a through line in all of our engagements economically with what we call Global South countries. And then let me give one more specific example, and I'm sure Naz will have more to say on this because I think DFC is really at the tip of the spear, but on these issues is our mineral security partnership, which is run out of state and is really focused on how you accelerate the development of clean energy supply chains. So it's really marrying up two administration priorities, right? It's the supply chain diversification, but also our global clean energy transition. And there it's really about building out the clean energy value chain from start to finish. So this is everything from extraction to secondary recovery to processing all the way up to recycling. And through the Mineral Security Partnership, we're working in 5 projects in Africa. We're also working in other parts of the world. And again, maybe I'll turn to Naz to speak more about the specific projects. But I think the value proposition here is that these projects are not supposed to be extractive or exploitative. They're really supposed to be about adding value to the host country's economy by being inclusive, by bringing communities into the process, being transparent, and then also hopefully helping these economies grow by moving up the value chain. So they're not just doing the extraction, but hopefully building the skills to also do later parts of the value chain. And then the final thing I'll say is the diversification of supply chains also goes the other way. And with the Mineral Security Partnership, I think what it really reflects is that because it's not just the US, but it's this coalition of countries that are investing in these places, the host countries are not reliant on just one investor, right? They have their pick of countries to choose from and public-private partnerships to choose from in developing out their own supply chains.
Those are great points, and a lot of things I want to come back to, including you touch about minerals. I obviously would like to dig in a little more into the critical minerals question and how that relates to competition with China in that space and our engagement in the developing world. But thank you, that's fantastic. Niles, did you want to add anything?
Well, I'll just add with a comment at the end. I mean, I completely agree with Daphne. This is about our values and our interests, and that's true both for the United States and for our partner countries around the world. When the U.S. is making these offerings, it's often done in partnership through the settings that Daphne mentioned. Those are formal at a strategic level. They're also formal at the very tactical project level. Just to give you a couple examples, DFC has signed MOUs in both settings in East Asia and the Western Hemisphere that Daphne mentioned, one with the Inter-American Development Bank in the Western Hemisphere to share diligence on projects and actually get in to this work together. And then with our trilateral partners in Asia, we have a trilateral partnership with Japan and Korea, as well as with Japan and Australia, that helps us do this work in a tactical way. But it's also about this idea we talked of at the very beginning, about delivering for people with a value proposition that makes sense in the context where these projects are actually based. It's about being respectful of local conditions, making sure these projects are employing workers in the country where the investment is being directed. It's about not being burdensome financially, and that is a huge part of the reason why DFC works with the private sector. Our projects don't burden public sector balance sheets because they're not to governments, and that's a core element of the strategy. But at the end of the day, it's also about delivering results and projects. You know, to give you a couple examples on critical minerals, last year, DFC invested over $700 million in Africa alone. Our deputy CEO, Nisha Biswal, was just in the region 2 weeks ago to make that announcement. We're thrilled about that work. We invested nearly $4 billion last year just in climate and clean energy solutions around the world. It's a significant portion of our portfolio, and we also make similar investments in the health supply chain and the food supply chain that I'd be happy to talk about in more depth. As we've been discussing across the conversation, that's good for everyone involved.
That's great. Simon, anything to add on this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think the critical minerals is probably one of the most obvious sectors where you see this competition, conflict, whatever you want to call it, between the US and China and other countries. And how to solve that issue, because as we've seen before, and for the whole history of Africa, other countries have come in and exploited those minerals and taken them away and left very little behind other than pollution. And that's still going on to a large extent today, which has left Africa poorer and dirtier. Now, how do we move away from that to the point where more of that value is left within the continent so those people can effectively get richer, get better educated, and start buying more products from the US and Europe and everywhere else, which is that whole capitalist virtual circle. But at a very practical level, how do you convince US companies to go in there and actually invest in this? Because you've got a mine, it's dirty. Where is the energy going to come from for that mine? Probably fossil fuel. What about the logistics? Because you need a road to get there. You need warehouses to store this. Even when you've got it out of the ground, you've got to process it. That's a dirty, dirty job. Are there US companies that have the ability to do that? So to actually achieve what you want to achieve is extremely difficult in practice. And I think it's going down to specific examples like that where you can identify where the package that the US is providing is either working or not working. Now, Chinese have had a lot of experience of putting this package together. It works very well for China, not necessarily for the countries where it's been investing. What package is the US offering to counter that? So if you're going to one of these countries like DRC, which historically the Chinese were heavily involved in, what is the US offering today to the president who just got reelected? From a very practical point of view, I mean, is there a company in the US that will process those minerals? Or are they just going to dig them out of the ground and send them somewhere else? Yeah. And if I want to go and do that, are you going to give me a loan? Or am I going to get US Exim finance? Is the State Department going to support me in these actions? Because the Chinese have an incredible infrastructure in many countries in the global south supporting their industry. It's a fantastic package. They give insurance, they give free money, they give diplomatic support. It's an unbelievable package that enables Chinese businesses to win most of these contracts all around the world. The US has to match that. And that's really the challenge for the US. It's going and coming up with a better product. It's not the sort of big philosophical thing, because at a very practical level, people in these countries, they want to get richer because they're poor. They want to have education for their kids, they want healthcare, they want food, they want water. Now, if you don't provide it, they'll get it from somewhere else. And right now, they're getting it from China. And this is why the US is perceived to be losing out, because its package is just not good enough.
And I mean, and I'm curious if you guys have responses to that, but I think this is something we've been talking about throughout the conference. I mean, I think just in the last conference in the technology panel this morning, people were saying, well, the best way to compete with China is to actually compete. And I think the messaging there was that obviously there has been progress made. I think we've all seen that in the last few years, but there's a lot more that needs to be done because China is offering such a great alternative and a packaged alternative that hits a lot of these different factors that need to be brought to bear. Anything to add on what Simon just said, or to jump in?
Well, two comments that I think are helpful, and it's an incredibly useful perspective. At the end of the day, it all comes down to delivering. I think that's one of the themes of the conversation so far. You know, we have seen over the last few years, and I've been briefed recently on some interesting data that's come out in the past few months on the trajectory of Chinese development financing. It's peaked in 2016. It's gone down quite a bit since then, and over the past couple years, the United States has actually eclipsed it. So I think there's an element of the story here that is grounded in a historical perspective. There's the future, and the future looks like it's shaping up to be potentially different. The other thing I'll note is that one of the enduring strengths for the United States is our approach to doing this with partners and allies that has been fundamental to the administration's approach on a whole range of foreign policy issues, not just those that are relevant for this conversation, but it's also been structural as well. And I'll give you one example. At the Development Finance Corporation, our predecessor agency actually had to invest in U.S. companies or projects that had a U.S. nexus. That is no longer true. So when I'm referencing dollar figures or talking about specific projects, sometimes those are with Indian companies or British companies or Japanese companies or Korean companies or multiple companies. Sometimes it's with a foreign company and a foreign government. That type of lattice work, that partnership, massively increases the opportunity set, the opportunity, I think, and hopefully ability to deliver in the way that Simon was discussing. You know, of course, you need to go down to the project level to talk about specific examples of where that can work. But those two sort of elements, I think, are worth adding to the mix.
That's a really important point. I don't think that's understood as well, that shift has been made from OPIC to DFC. And then you bring me to kind of where I want to go in the conversation, which is the allies and partners piece, which, of course, has been discussed throughout the conference. And you mentioned this a little bit already, Naz, but speak a little bit more perhaps about how DFC is working with other development finance institutions in other countries, at the multilateral level, African Development Bank, you already mentioned IADB. And then we turn to Daphne for more perhaps on working with allies on the kind of infrastructure and financing, and in the infrastructure piece, the other kind of alternatives, PGII, Global Gateway, what the Japanese are doing, what the Indians are doing, what the Koreans are doing to some extent. So I'd be curious, your thoughts on how that's going and how centrally the administration views those partnerships.
Yeah, well, I'll be brief because, as you mentioned, Dave, we talked about some of this. But I'll give you three examples. The Development Finance Corporation recently signed at the President's American Partnership for Economic Prosperity Summit in November a partnership with IDB to share projects, share diligence, share information, co-invest and co-finance with one another where we can, but where we can't, just to pass off good opportunities and ideas to each other. It's part of this push to get tactical and deliver at the ground level. We have a similar partnership, as I mentioned, with partners and countries in Asia. And then the third I'd like to just emphasize is our work with European allies to help in the wake of Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine. We signed MOUs with EBRD, with EIB, with other players, other DFIs in Europe, to try and channel our collective resources to do as much as we can to invest in Ukraine today. And we've invested actually over $400 million in Ukraine already, just since over the past year and since the start of the war. And there's opportunity to do that on the ground right away, even in the run-up to reconstruction, but also to invest in our allies and partners around Ukraine to help them diversify where they are receiving their energy, for example, to help invest in their long-term economic resilience. those partnerships unlock all kinds of opportunities. Some of you may be familiar with one of the landmark investments the U.S. government made last year. We helped the government of Ecuador essentially reissue its debt. This debt for nature swap is what it's called, saved the government hundreds of millions of dollars on their public balance sheet, but it also created a fund for conservation of the Galapagos Islands. That's good for the environment, it's good for conservation in that country. It actually creates a significant number of jobs in the ocean economy in and around those islands, but it also, of course, on the strategic competition side, is a totally different approach to dealing with financial distress at the sovereign level. So that's one example of what this can do. There are others across the world that I'm happy to share, but those partnerships are central to how we're approaching the work.
That's great. And Daphne, to you, so on the infrastructure piece, where do you see some of that collaboration with allies and partners, but also more broadly than that, where else do you see those partnerships with allies in the developing world as being most important? And where are the greatest challenges that you would kind of see in terms of partnering with countries that, yes, there are allies or partners, but maybe we have different priorities in what we're trying to achieve in the developing world vis-a-vis competition with China or just generally?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, first I would just say that our engagement and our vast constellation of allies and partners is really the United States secret sauce. This is really our comparative advantage on the world stage. And when we talk about or think about sort of what are the challenges when it comes to working with them on strategic competition, I guess I would push back and say, if we were trying to create coalitions based on what we're against, we would have a lot of challenges. But what we're doing is really building these coalitions, and they're taking various forms based on the specific issue set and problem we're trying to solve. But we're really doing it based on what we're for. And so I'll just go back to, taking a step back as to what is our broader vision for the international order. And it's one where we have a free world, an open world, a prosperous world, and a secure world. And that's, I think, a vision that most countries can get behind. And when we lead with that, that's one that I think a lot of countries want to work together on to help build, preserve, update, and modernize. And so going back to your question specifically on infrastructure, there I think what we saw was that there is this clear infrastructure gap in developing countries, and we have seen the PRC come in and fill that, but there still is a yearning for, I think, sustainable, quality infrastructure that doesn't come with the negative externalities of environmental degradation or internal displacement or lack of transparency and some of these other issues that I think Naz got to, unsustainable debt burdens. And so what we're really trying to do is work through the G7 to provide an alternative. You've probably heard our secretary say this multiple times. We don't want to make countries choose, but we want to give them a choice. And so the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, PGI, is really one of those choices and offers. How do we provide a better offer to developing countries? And so through PGI, again, this is in coordination with the G7, we have already mobilized $30 billion towards a broader goal of mobilizing $600 billion by 2027. And so one of our landmark projects is in Africa and the Lobito corridor, and it's really about creating a connection between the port in Lobito across DRC to Zambia. And the whole idea behind PGI and these corridors is to build transportation connectivity, to build digital connectivity, to create clean energy jobs, and sort of lay them over one another for these transformative investments. So there recently we announced that it's not just the US doing this work, but we're doing it in partnership with the EU. Similarly, a couple months ago, we announced the India-Middle East corridor, IMEC, which is in partnership with India, the Saudis, the UAE, and our European partners to connect in all sorts of ways between Europe and Asia through the Middle East. So these are some of the ways that we're working specifically in the infrastructure piece. I'd also just note quickly, we also have other ways that we're partnering with our allies and partners for investments in developing countries. One clear example is the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. So these are investments, again, leveraging public sector dollars to encourage encourage more private sector investment towards clean energy transitions. And right now we have those partnerships in Vietnam, South Africa, and Indonesia. Another example of this is a recent health security partnership we have with the AU called VAX, where we're really trying to build the long-term health security of these countries by boosting agricultural productivity, helping build crops that are resilient to climate change, and I think getting to Simon's point, moving away from just aid and really trying to build the long-term resiliencies of these countries and doing it with our allies and partners.
That's great. Thank you. That was a lot of great information. And I think, some of it touches on what I think has been some themes throughout this conference thus far, which is, a sense, true or not, that China is engaging more on the ground in a lot of these countries, and the U.S. is not showing up to some extent. There was some discussion of, what's the solution to a lot of these problems, not just the U.S. government, but also in the private sector. Get on a plane and get to these places and actually be on the ground and experience it. Some discussion around the fact that, China is offering trainings across different domains to folks to come from the developing world to come to China. And that we're not doing that as much as we could be. We're not necessarily doing enough to ensure that we're cultivating talent in the tech sector in a lot of these countries. And part of that would be a problem with our visa regime. So not just a question for you, Daphne, but maybe for the group. Is there more that you feel we could be doing more broadly, the United States, but also other allied countries, to be engaging in a people-to-people way on the ground in a lot of these countries, being more open to having folks come to the United States, because we have, of course, still the best educational institutions in the world. We have a lot of things that are very attractive that China still does not have. So open that up to anyone who wants to jump in. Maybe Simon?
Yeah, I think I remember when DFC was formed, and I think it's been a huge plus for the U.S., what's happened with DFC and initiatives, and that's growing all the time. As you say, that they're expanding their mandates. So we've actually seen that on-the-ground projects getting funded by DFC. So I'd love to see you guys expand a lot more. I think you need more physical presence on the ground, as opposed to most of it currently run from Washington. So I think expanding that is a great thing. I think the State Department as well. I think a lot of the U.S. institutions have definitely upped their game. They were starting from scratch pretty much, but they are getting better all the time. I think one of the problems and sort of the pushbacks that I've seen at a practical level is that sometimes the U.S. is tying its packages too much to a set of political philosophies that don't necessarily match with the countries it's operating in. What the Chinese call cultural colonialism. And I think that is a major pushback in a lot of the countries that we operate, where there's a feeling that the U.S. is trying to impose its culture on the countries. And there's certainly been a huge resistance. And I was speaking with one of the African presidents about 3 weeks ago here in D.C., and he said he'll take the package from China, even though it's not as good as the U.S., because the U.S. wants to force its religious and other beliefs on his country, and that's not acceptable to his people. So I think that the U.S. is being heavy-handed in certain instances. We were trying to do some business in Uganda. Clearly that didn't go well because of the U.S. changed position on Uganda. Now, that's a huge problem for the private sector, because if we're investing in infrastructure, which could take 10 to 15 years to get our money back, if there are changes in the U.S. Stance on a country, which means they can no longer export into the U.S. market, and we're investing on the basis that those businesses are allowed to export, we've lost our investment. Now, we need to price that into our decision of whether to invest in that country, and the answer is no, we won't. So I think that is a major problem at your level, because it means that you're just massively increasing our risk.
I'm curious if Naz or Daphne, if you have thoughts on this, because this has been kind of a key point that has kept coming back to throughout the conference on different sides of the issue, right? We hear what you're saying about cultural colonialism. We had Bill Harry-Kausikan talking about the U.S. Being too preachy and that turning off some countries. But you also have, maybe discussions that in Latin America, the kind of values proposition that the U.S. offers is our strongest point. In Africa, Afrobarometer polling showing that despite the fact that there's generally positive views of engagement with China, that there's overwhelmingly a desire for democratic forms of government. And also points made during our governance and rights discussion about the fact that if you're engaging just at the elite level, you don't necessarily know what the public want from the civil society bottom-up perspective. So I think there's no right answer to this. I think it's a valid point. I think it's kind of one of these points that there's no solid answer to yet that involve need more
people,
investigation.
Do they want freedom? Do they want a good legal system? Do they want to end to corruption? Everybody around the world would say the same thing. Yeah, that's what we want. Yeah. We want safety, security. We want a better future for our kids. So, I mean, if you ask them that question, then the answer is yes. And if you ask the average American, do you believe in American policies and American culture? Most Americans would say yes, we have a great culture. But I think if you tied federal support in certain states in the US to the right to abortion, you would have a kickback from a lot of people within the US. So it's a similar thing when you go into other countries. If you are tying this aid to things which are just not acceptable to the local people, you will get kickback. And you would in this country as well.
That's a related point as well, related question on those. Anything else to add on that? Anyone else? Okay. Nas?
Well, I mean, I guess one quick thought would be to say, all of this is part of clearly a much larger conversation, but two of the themes that keep coming up to me as we debate and discuss these ideas are the notions of sustainability and accessibility. Mm-hmm. And on the sustainability front, that has a particular meaning. Of course, we mean in terms of the financial sustainability of the investment, its environmental sustainability, but fundamentally it's about the market-driven element of this. If there is a demand on the ground for a particular investment and we can help meet that demand, that's a much more sustainable approach than some sort of top-down approach with specific conditions. That's core to the model. I think that you can talk about particular situations where there may be some differences, but at the sort of broad level, it is a fundamental difference between how we're operating and I think how other countries might approach this work. And then on the accessibility side, I mean, this goes all the way back to the beginning to what we were talking about with the first question. Why should we be investing the resources in getting out into the world and expanding this work? DFC's been in a position to expand its overseas presence. That is something, I think, Simon, that you're very right to call out. At the end of the day, if you're accessible on the ground, it increases outcomes on all of these dimensions. We're also trying to be more accessible in Washington. We've just announced that we're organizing our team around our sector priorities, which are energy, infrastructure, including critical minerals and technological infrastructure, health and agriculture, and small business support. So that makes it a lot easier to know where to go depending on what you need. But there's, of course, more we can do on that front. It has to be part of this broader conversation of how we're making sure we're delivering for people around the world and here in the United States.
Yeah, that's great points. I want to follow up with you just to get a little more granularity. I think everyone would be interested to learn a little bit more about how DFC makes its decisions as to which projects to invest and finance in. How do you balance the merits of individual projects when you make decisions about what you're going to finance with the kind of strategic, more foreign policy considerations right around perhaps where China might be interested for strategic reasons and obviously where the U.S. for strategic geopolitical reasons feels the need to give more attention and give more support?
Well, maybe to start at the project level and then expand a little bit into the overall strategy, every project that DFC invests in has to meet a range of standards on both the development side and the foreign policy side. We're assessing our projects for their development impact. We're assessing them for their compliance with U.S. sanctions policy. We do know your customer vetting, for example. But we're also looking at the foreign policy impact of those transactions as well, and that is all part of the assessment that then gets put forward to our board if it's a transaction that has to go to our board, which many do, for assessment. So that's at the project level. At the sort of strategic level, a lot of it comes down to how you organize that sector strategy that I mentioned. That's a key, way of suggesting to the world this is how we're going to prioritize where we work. Same with the overseas expansion, strategy. We obviously, maybe not obviously, at the moment we cannot put someone in every country in the world. So the countries where we are putting people is a signal of what we'd like to prioritize. But fundamentally and sort of built into the model are all these ideas that we've been talking about sustainability, mobilizing private capital. That in its own sense is a strategy, and it's a strategy that's bipartisan. It's a strategy that has earned wide support within the interagency. It's why we work so closely with Daphne, her team, and the State Department more generally. It's why we're part of the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. This connects to so many other elements of what we're trying to accomplish. So it's embedded in the mission, it's embedded in our organization, and it also gets reflected at every project in our assessment.
That's great. And that leads me to kind of my last question before we go to some great audience questions I see here, which is to the point about how to prioritize and coordinate across the U.S. government. And maybe I'd turn especially to Naz and to Daphne on this. I asked the same question of Assistant Administrator Schiffer. We have the idea now that we are to some extent competing with China all around the globe. We have DFC, State, USAID, EXIM, all these different agencies that are involved in this. To what extent do you think there's effective coordination happening across the U.S. government right now to figure out where those scarce resources should be going and how different agencies should be partnering on these issues to really achieve maximum effect from the U.S. government in the kind of whole of government kind of terminology that we use these days, focusing on priorities?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and I think actually we've come a really long way. And here in Washington, I think we're really doing a good job of coordinating in diagnosing the problem, figuring out what is the right tool for addressing that problem, and then working together throughout implementation to ensure that we're still staying true to the strategic vision behind a particular project. I would say, going back to maybe something Simon said, where I think we can still improve is how we present that coordination on the ground. And by that I mean China is coming with the whole package. And we, in fact, have the whole package. Mm-hmm. It's just that we're showing up at different times, and we're not necessarily providing and presenting that whole suite of tools when we're engaging with local governments or local populations. So we go in and say, we're happy to do an assessment. We're happy to provide trainers to get you up to speed on negotiation tactics. We will help you with the monitoring and evaluation at the end, but we're all doing this sort of piecemeal when we're on the ground, even if back here at home we are, I think, thinking through that whole life cycle of a project. So it's partly about, I think, just telling our story better, but I think it's also about coordinating on the ground so that host governments and populations, when they're engaging with us, know that they're not only getting a whole package, but they almost have a one-stop shop to go to just make the whole transaction much more seamless and efficient.
That's great. Naz, anything to add?
I couldn't agree more. We have a very strong bottoms-up approach. We're doing a much better job in Washington of connecting it top-down, but I think we can tell our story better around the world. One other thing I'll be open about, too, is that part of doing this work at the standards level that we've discussed over the course of this conversation takes work. It takes work to do the additional feasibility studies or the additional environmental studies, and that takes time. The government does not operate as quickly as a private sector timeline. I think that is not a statement that will shock anyone, and I think we have work to do to get close to that. We might not ever be able to get all the way there because of what we're trying to ensure these projects do the standards that they meet. But that's an area, too, where we can continue to coordinate better on the interagency side. But the strides have been significant. It's a function of some of the initiatives that we've talked about in the past. It's a function of the connectivity between our teams, both in Washington and around the world, but especially out in the global South, the focus of this conference. It's a resource question, too. Not every agency has someone on the ground, and therefore it makes it a lot more difficult to do, I think, exactly what Daphne's right to call out as the core element of what we should be doing in telling our story.
That's great. Well, you both touched on telling our story, which gets to the one of the questions we have here. I mean, we've talked a lot about the kind of concrete things the U.S. government is doing and could be doing more of, and how that relates to the private sector. But a lot of this comes down to messaging. It comes down to how the public is kind of understanding what the U.S. is doing or what China is doing in many cases. So the question here related to that is, the Chinese government and companies are very effective at getting local media coverage and hype around proposed aid and investment, even when that money doesn't materialize or is less than what the U.S. Or the EU are offering. But many local publics end up oblivious to that fact. Is there discussion within the U.S. about doing this telling our story, doing this messaging, doing this type of PR better, so the publics have a more accurate understanding of what U.S. is doing to help local development, what more could be done in this space. So open that up to anyone who wants to comment. Simon?
Yeah, I mean, I'll come from the customer point of view. I think the U.S. government has a lot of money and a lot of great technology and a lot of great solutions. I live here in D.C. This is what I do for a living. I probably only know 5% of what the U.S. government's offering. It's so difficult to figure out what exists. And once you find it, you sit there and go, oh my God, this is amazing. But it's extremely difficult to find out what's happening. I think the idea of having one platform that coordinates is definitely needed, because people like us need to go to one department, not get shunted from. We're doing a project here in the US, and it's 6 different departments within the government, and we're 4 years into it now, and we're still doing paperwork. I mean, it's a nightmare getting through this system. So it does need improving. I think the media message, the US has been extremely bad at this, and China has been very good at getting its message across about the good stuff it's doing and the bad stuff the US is doing. How you solve that, though, is a problem, because the US is a private sector run economy. The US should not be funding propaganda campaigns saying, look how good we are. That's not how the US works. Other countries do, which is why they're getting their message out much better than the US. But I think one of the things we looked at, and we've discussed with various groups here, is getting messages out about what the US is doing from a positive perspective. So the success stories that you're talking about, the minerals thing, which is huge, but nobody has heard of it. I heard of it because I'm on the press releases, but the reality is that most people don't read the press releases, and they're not seeing this, and it's just not getting out in the media. And there needs to be more of an effort from the US government to shout about its successes, because it's doing a lot, but people don't realize it. I was at an IDB meeting before Christmas. I was speaking on one of the panels, and the IDB was saying they have more money than they have projects, because nobody knows they're giving out money. And the guy was sitting through and going, what he's offering to the Caribbean nations, and I'm going, Christ, I want some of that. I didn't know. So there is an incredible range of stuff the US is doing. And on the technology side, it's the same. I spent 2 hours this morning talking to a US technology company which has an incredible solution for off-grid electricity. Now, they're actually funded by the DOE here, and they're talking to us about how they can expand into the Global South. Now, nobody here, you guys have probably never heard of it. Most of the world haven't heard of this company, but it's already raised hundreds of millions of dollars. It is a great solution, and I was chatting while I was in Europe to Ukraine about whether they should implement it, and they just said, please bring it over straight away. So there's a great story, and nobody's telling it. And I think that's a shame, because the US should be shouting about it. When US makes all these aid donations, nobody knows. I mean, other countries put it sort of 2 cents, and the US comes up with $100 million, and the country that puts up the 2 cents gets the credit.
Well, Simon, you've inspired me.
Maybe we're over time, so last comments from each of you.
Yeah, I'll be quick. The U.S. government and the Development Finance Corporation are open for business. DFC last year invested $9.3 billion in private sector companies around the world. I think most people do not know that. That was a record for the institution. The year before was a record for the institution. And that year we invested $7.4 billion. So the growth is significant. If you know companies, or you happen to work at a company or represent a company that's looking for debt support, debt financing, equity investments, political risk insurance in countries around the world, you can come to DFC. But if you're looking for other kinds of products, there's all sorts of tools that are available to you in the US government. Our colleagues at the State Department, our colleagues who work on the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment team can help direct you to that. I'm sure Daphne will have more to say on this, but please do be in touch, and please do spread the word. That's one small thing we can do to start telling the story better, in addition to some of the broader challenges that we were discussing earlier.
Yeah, and since this is our concluding remarks, I'll just say that just going back, I think, to the original point about our vision and where we draw our source of strength, and I think it is the fact that we've got a free, open, pluralistic, and really diverse society. So when we think about how do we tell our story, I think building on something Simon said, it's not just the US government telling that story. It's the private sector going out and telling that story. It's civil society going out and telling that story. It's our massive diaspora communities who have the relationships with the populations on the ground in many of these global South countries. So I think when we think about amplifying our efforts, it's really doing it with what is the greatest source of strength for us as a country, which is just our inclusive, empowering system that allows for multiple voices with multiple views to really get out and share our story.
Great. Well, that is a fantastic point to end on. Thank you, Daphne. Thank you, Naz. Thank you, Simon. I think we covered the waterfront here in terms of what the U.S. is already doing in the Global South and what is yet to come, what we perhaps could be doing better and building on some of those successes, as well as at the end here really talking about getting that word out about what is already happening and what is to come. So thank you very much for a great panel. Let's thank our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we will now take a 10-minute break when we will come back for our final panel where we will talk about our allies and their perspectives on these issues. Thank you.